Speaking about this particular topic and what's going to play out here, we are joined by the Associate Dean and Criminology Professor from Tarleton State University, Dr. Alex Del Carmen. And all right, Professor, so this one has all the makings. You had somebody who's a celebrity that ended up trying to play the role of victim, staged a semi-elaborate plot, and now we have all the cameras and all the evidence for the world to see, and he's still denying the situation. From a legal perspective at this standpoint, what can we expect to play out from here?
Well, there's a legal, and by the way, good morning, and thanks for having me this morning. I think at the end of the day, you've got the damage that has been done that everybody's talking about now, which is that this really hampers the ability of legitimate victims to come forward and actually report, being subject or being a victim of these hate crimes. And then secondly, from a legal side, what we are going to be expecting to do is now basically for the criminal justice system to start doing what it does best, right, which is basically put this person through a process, whether it's going to be a jury trial or some sort of a plea agreement at some point. I think we're likely going to see some sort of a heavy penalty coming out of the court in Chicago in this particular case, given the publicity that it's had.
When you take a look at a case that is this high profile, I was taking a look at some of the sentencing. It looks like there could be a minimum 1 year jail term up to 3 years based upon just the felony false police report that he filed. In a high profile situation, how does that play typically in the legal system? Is that something that could lead to a lesser penalty, or perhaps could they make an example of him and go on the heavy end?
I would say the latter, right? And the reason for that is because you got to realize that the courts, and oftentimes, they see it from this perspective, right? You wasted the resources of law enforcement. All these detectives that have been working this case have been, pretty much distracted from their cases that they're legitimately working. All these victims that are waiting for justice to come, when you're paying all these thousands of dollars for these detectives to use their time to investigate what appears now to be a false claim. And then secondly, the judge, right? The judge is going to be, they're wasting their time basically going through this process and using taxpayers' dollars. So they're going to make an example out of this. There's no question. And I would argue that there's probably going to be some jail time combined with some other penalties attached to it.
Dr. Carmen, is there any case that you can recall that this one resembles that we might be familiar with?
Not in recent times. What we've seen, obviously, is we've seen the high-profile cases that, i.e. the O.J. Simpson case, and various others where, we've seen the criminal justice system play out on television on a daily basis. But, in recent times, the past 4 or 5 years, it's been all about accusations. It's been all about, claims that have been made towards men, towards individuals that have been abusing, their victims over the years. And so there's been sort of a general sense of social justice and the expectation that, even though justice may be delayed, it's eventually going to come, through. And in this particular case now, we reverse that logic, right, which is now we actually acknowledge that there are cases when people make false claims that could have easily, if it hadn't been for good law enforcement in Chicago, it could have easily looked the other way.
The definition of a hate crime is a prejudice-motivated crime which occurs when a perpetrator targets a victim because of his or her membership in a certain social group or race. Professor, do you think that ultimately Jussie Smollett should be charged with a hate crime here?
I'm not sure, but I can tell you right now that it's equally, important that this individual is held accountable, for falsifying a claim, right, which is a felony. And even though we know in the criminal justice system that, these false claims oftentimes, are not prosecuted, that oftentimes DAs look the other way when people, go to law enforcement and falsify a claim. In this particular case, because of the international attention that is received, I would venture to say that DA and that particular court in Chicago is going to absolutely render justice in this particular case in a heavy way. That others will learn, hopefully, from this experience, that they are not going to be wasting law enforcement's resources in the years to come.
Is it typical, or do you think it's a somewhat unique circumstance that the brothers that were hired to carry this out were ultimately treated as witnesses rather than conspirators?
Well, it's oftentimes in the criminal justice system, and those of us that work in it, I can tell you that, it's not unusual to sometimes have a suspect turn into a victim, turn into a suspect again. And there are times when the suspect is also a victim, right? And they may be offenders, but they also maybe have been victimized at some point. So it's not unusual in the real criminal justice system to see that. What is interesting is what was the trigger that changed them from being suspects to being victims. And I think it was really a good attorney that they ended up hiring that essentially went to law enforcement and said, look, I'm defending my clients, and I get the fact that I'm supposed to be representing them, but I got to show you here all the evidence that shows that these people are really victims. They're not perpetrators. And that's when law enforcement began to see it from a different perspective. And now we have what we have for the world to know, right?
Speaking of perspective, we appreciate you checking in with yours. Tarleton State University professor and Associate Dean, Dr. Alex Dale Carmen.